In this video, we're going to be looking at allocative efficiency, and I want to emphasize at the outset here that this is really the core argument of neoclassical or orthodox economic theory. The arguments that we're going to be making, although we're going to be doing it with some formal modeling, is very simple. The argument is markets maximize the net benefits or economic welfare or surplus to society as a whole by allocating society's scarce resources optimally. And I want to emphasize here that this is a very strong argument about the benefits in terms of the efficient allocation of scarce resources of a capitalist or free market system. The argument, again, is that at least if the markets are operating correctly, and we're not necessarily assuming that they always will operate correctly, but if they are operating correctly, we're going to get the most net benefit minus cost, out of our scarce resources as a society as a whole. Again, we're not assuming that the markets are necessarily operating correctly. We're just saying that if they do, then we'll get this outcome. So there are a couple of basic requirements or assumptions to make the argument that we're going to be looking at here. First, benefits and costs to society must be the same as the benefits and costs to the consumers and producers, or really the demanders and suppliers in the market at hand. This is another way of saying we can't have any externalities, and we'll come back to that notion later on in the term. And the second assumption or requirement is that we have a competitive markets. There can't be any monopoly, or for that matter, monopsony, which we'll talk about also later on in the term. So assuming there aren't any of these market failures, then the argument we're going to be making is that the demand curve in a market reflects the marginal social benefits. That is the additional benefit to society from each additional unit of whatever it is we're talking about for whatever market it is that we're talking about. The supply curve then, on the other hand, is going to reflect the marginal social cost. That is the additional cost to society of producing each additional unit of whatever it is we're talking about. So let's look, for instance, at a demand curve for, again, whatever it might be. Let's say this hypothetical demand curve looks something like this. Now, according to this demand curve, a price of $9 corresponds to a quantity demanded of 1 unit. We can see that here. Now, one way to read that is that consumers are willing to pay $9 for that first unit of whatever this thing might be, and we can infer from that then that that thing, that first unit in particular, must be worth $9 to consumers. Otherwise, why would they be willing to pay $9 for it? And if we go further to assume that consumers represent society in the sense of anybody who wants to be a consumer of this product in society is able to, then we can infer that $9 represents the actual value of that first unit of this good to society as a whole. And we can go on down the demand curve and look at each next additional or marginal units the same way. According to this demand curve, the price of $8 corresponds to a quantity of 2. We can infer from that then that demanders here are willing to pay $8 for that second unit, and therefore, again, we can infer that $8 is what that second unit of this thing is worth to society as a whole. Which, of course, is just to say that the additional or marginal social benefit of that second unit is $8. Notice then, if we wanted to talk about the total social benefit of 2 units of this thing, then we would just add up the marginal social benefits of the first 2 things. $9 for that first unit, $8 for the second unit, and therefore the total social value for 2 units is $17. And we can go on down the line and do this for each additional unit, adding the marginal social benefits of that next unit based on the price that demanders are willing to pay to derive the total benefit to society of however many units we wanted to talk about. And one additional step we can take is we can assume infinitely divisible units. So instead of talking about the first unit, the second unit, the third unit, we could be talking about the 1/1,000,000th of the first unit, the 2/1,000,000th of the first unit, and so on down the line. And what this would do graphically here is it would divide these bars up into smaller and smaller ones until we eventually got something that approximated simply the area under the demand curve itself as representing the total value for some quantity of this thing to society. And this will be useful to us because we'll be calculating total benefits to society, and we can do that simply by taking the area under a demand curve, which is going to give us usually a triangle of some sort. And of course, the formula for the area of a triangle is simply 1/2 times the base times the height. So this is the logic behind the idea that the demand curve represents the marginal social benefits of whatever thing it is for whatever market we're talking about, and that the area under the demand curve then represents the total social benefit for some quantity of that thing. And we can go over to the supply curve and see that the logic of the arguments is very similar. Here we've got a supply curve that tells us that a price of $1 corresponds to a quantity of 1 unit. We can infer from that then that suppliers are willing to supply that first unit of whatever this thing is for $1, and we can infer from that that the cost to suppliers must be $1. The logic for that is pretty simple. If it cost more than $1 to produce whatever this thing is, that first unit of whatever this thing is, then suppliers wouldn't be willing to produce and sell it or supply it for only $1. They'd be making a loss, of course. Likewise, if it costs less than $1 to produce this thing, then we can assume that competition would drive the price down to the actual cost so that nobody would be able to charge more than whatever it is to cost to produce this first unit. Therefore, if the supply curve tells us that $1 corresponds to a quantity of 1, we can infer that it cost $1 to produce that first unit. And we can do this on down the line. We can say that the supply curve tells us that a price of $2 corresponds to a quantity of 2, then it must have cost $2 to produce that second unit. If the price of $3 corresponds to a quantity of 3 on the supply curve, then it must have cost $3 to produce that third unit. And all we're saying here is that the supply curve represents the marginal cost curve, really the marginal social cost curve, representing all costs to society of this good. And like we did with the demand curve, then we can just assume infinitely divisible units and then say that the area under the supply curve for some quantity of this thing represents the total social cost to society of producing that quantity of this thing. So for instance, if this supply curve looks something like this, we're looking at, for a quantity of 8, a base of that triangle of 8 units and a height of that triangle, or a length of that triangle, of 8 units. The area then of that triangle is going to be 1/2 times the base times the height. The base times the height is 8 times 8, or 64, and then we take half of that to see that the area of this triangle must be 32. And again, then 32 represents the total social cost of producing 8 units of this thing. So these are the basic components of this argument that markets will allocate society's scarce resources efficiently. Again, it's demand tells us the marginal social benefits, and supply tells us the marginal social cost. For any given quantity, then, in the market, we can take the area under the demand curve up to that quantity, and that tells us the total social benefit, and then the area under the supply curve tells us the total social cost. Now, this brings us into the picture where we bring both supply and demand together. We've seen this market model, of course, before. In equilibrium, this market should produce a quantity at Q star and a price of P star. So I want to look then at the total benefit and the total cost and net the cost out of the benefit to produce what we call total economic welfare, or total economic surplus. And this is really a term that means net benefits. So from here on out, if you see the word surplus, think net benefit, and that's just benefit minus cost. So again, if this market is normally going to produce at a quantity of Q star, then the area under the demand curve, this entire blue shaded area here, is going to give us our total benefit to society of that quantity of this thing. We can look then at the supply curve, and we know that the area under the supply curve, this red or pinkish area here, is going to represent the total social cost. And what this means then is that that leftover blue area represents the net benefit to society. It's the total benefit to society minus, that is not counting that red area, which represents again the total social cost. So that blue area then is giving us our total welfare, our total surplus. And again, what neoclassical economists are arguing then is that that area there, the total surplus, is the maximum surplus or net benefit that society could get out of this particular product, whatever it might be. Now, of course, in a capitalist society, we're not going to evenly distribute that benefit, that net benefit or surplus, across society. Only certain people are going to get that surplus or net benefits, and of course you can probably already guess who they're going to be. It's going to be the people in the market, specifically the demanders and the suppliers, or what we'll call here consumer surplus and producer surplus. So consumer surplus represents the utility, which is to say the benefits to the consumers or the demanders in this market that they get from buying a product minus the price they have to pay. That's their costs. So again, surplus here is telling us net benefits, the utility minus the price. Producer surplus then is going to represent the value the producer gets from selling the products. That is the price that they sell at, the revenues they generate from selling this product, minus the cost of having produced it. So again, going back to a basic supply and demand curve, let's say this market is going to produce an equilibrium price of $5 and an equilibrium quantity of 5 units. Everything under that demand curve up until 5 units is going to represent total social benefit, and then everything under the supply curve is going to represent total social cost. The net effect, that area up to 5 units between the supply and demand curves, then represents the net benefit to society, or the economic surplus to society. Part of that will be consumer surplus, and part of that will be producer surplus. And again, I want to emphasize this notion of surplus simply means net benefit. So anytime you're trying to find consumer or producer surplus, I always want you to be thinking about the thing on the graph that represents the benefits and the thing on the graph that represents the cost to that group. In this case, if we're looking at consumer surplus, we know that the demand represents the consumers and the demand represents the benefit. So we know that for consumer surplus, the benefit is going to be represented by the demand curve, and the market price, that is to say, the price that consumers are going to have to pay for this product, then must represent the cost. So if we're looking for consumer surplus as net benefit, we're going to be looking at the area below the demand curve down to the price that consumers are paying, which in this case is $5. Producer surplus works kind of in the reverse. The supply curve we know is telling us the cost, specifically the marginal cost to producers of producing this thing. So that's the cost side. The benefit side then is represented by the revenues they make from selling this thing. And in this case, their revenues are given by the $5 per unit that they're selling at. So producer surplus is going to be the area below the benefit represented by a price of $5 down to the costs represented by the supply curve itself. And with the numbers we have then, we've got enough to calculate the actual value for consumer and producer surplus. That consumer surplus triangle has a base of 5 units and a height of 5 up to 10. That is a height of 5 units. So the area of that triangle, again representing consumer surplus, is base times height. 5 times 5 is 25. And of course, it's a triangle, so we take 1/2 of that. So we get a consumer surplus of 12.5. This won't always or even usually be the case, but producer surplus actually comes out the same. The height is 5, the base is 5, so 1/2 5 times 5 is 1/2 of 25, or 12.5 for the producer surplus as well. Again, the fact that consumer and producer surplus came out to be the same numbers in both instances is purely coincidental. It's just because of how I've set up these supply and demand curves in this particular example. Now, once again, the argument we're making out of neoclassical theory is that if there's no intervention in the market and there's no market failure, if we just let the market do what it does, then the market equilibrium, the price and quantity in equilibrium here, is going to be such that consumer and producer surplus as a whole, or total economic surplus or welfare, is maximized. This is what we call allocative efficiency. The argument is that at the equilibrium quantity, the market is going to be producing up to the point where the additional benefit to society, represented by the demand curve, of the last unit produced is just equal to the additional cost to society, represented by the supply curve, and therefore the maximum net benefit possible has been created by producing that quantity. So to understand why this is the case, let's look at examples in which the market, for whatever reason, might produce a quantity less than or greater than Q star. Let's say, for instance, that, again, for whatever reason, we know that Q sub 0 here, our beginning equilibrium quantity, is the quantity that will maximize net benefits or economic welfare or surplus to society, maximize consumer and producer surplus taken together. But for whatever reason, the market produces at Q sub 1 instead. In this case, you can see pretty obviously that that means that only quantities up to Q sub 1 will be generated, and therefore only consumer surplus and producer surplus up to Q sub 1 will be generated as well. And what that means then, of course, is that other part of consumer surplus and producer surplus that we had before at a quantity of Q sub 0 doesn't get produced, and therefore the surplus doesn't get generated either. What we're producing here in this case then is what neoclassical economists call dead weight loss. That is the value over and above costs that could be had from more outputs. So in the example of producing less than the original equilibrium quantity, it's pretty clear that that would create less surplus in general. But what about a situation in which the market, for whatever reason, produces more than Q sub 0? In this case, what we're actually looking at is, again, an example of dead weight loss. And the reasoning is, if you look at the supply curve, again, representing marginal social cost, the additional cost of producing each unit, and compare it to the demand curve for these quantities beyond Q sub 0, what you see is that each quantity past Q sub 0 is actually costing society more to produce than the benefits, again represented by the demand curve, that society is getting from consuming those units. So we call this dead weight loss as well. It's a net loss of surplus to society because the cost is actually above the benefits. And this is really all there is to this argument, that the market, again, assuming it's competitive, assuming it's working correctly, will produce an equilibrium quantity, and that's the equilibrium quantity that will maximize society's net benefit, its consumer and producer surplus taken together, which is really just another way of saying that it will allocate just the right amount of society's scarce resources to producing just the right quantity of whatever this thing is that we're talking about in this particular markets. And again, I want to emphasize that this is the central arguments of neoclassical theory, really both on the microeconomic and the macroeconomic side.